I hope the tech guy shows up today.
Jesus Christ.
I love it. Man from Lane, you're on a roll today.
Dude, he was on a roll. He was on a roll the other day too. Shit, man. He had dad jokes for days last episode.
Right.
DGFD.
Hey, we're recording already. What?
Yeah.
Nate slips that shit in like a ninja.
Yep.
Dude.
It's like how a photographer.
It's like he's our tech guy. Yeah.
Well, if I said 3, 2, 1, go, I wouldn't capture it in the moment.
That's true.
It's like the observer effect, you know? It's like once you know you're being watched, you act differently.
Did you say the observer effect? I could see that.
Yeah, observer effect. a fantastic scenario for Delta Green, the role playing.
Yes. Yes, it is.
Ooh.
Speaking of Delta Green, when are we going to play some more Delta Green?
Oh, yes. Well, I'm ready whenever you guys are.
We should consider doing that soon.
I'll put a schedule for it. I'll post and feel it out with some patrons. So, why are we here today, Nate?
Why is any of us here today? Oh, you were getting into the episode. I thought you were getting metaphysical.
Oh, I thought he was too. I was going to be like, well, I'm here because my mom met a tech guy.
Seriously?
Yeah, actually.
There's a lot of tech guys in New Hampshire, I hear.
That's actually true. There's actually a lot of small tech companies that are based out of New Hampshire. Fun fact. But yeah, we're here to do a bit of a rant. More of a discussion, I guess, about a recent YouTube review of Arkham Horror the card game by No Pun Included.
Review in quotes of review.
Yeah, and we kind of wanted to just go over the review itself, touch on their original review, and kind of just give our general thoughts and rebuttals to their review. So, Vase, since you seem to be very vocal about all of this, why don't you go ahead and start off with just the beginning of the review, I guess.
Okay. For those who are not familiar, No Pun Included reviews board games. That's really what their YouTube channel is all about. They'd reviewed Arkham Horror the card game a few years ago, and they didn't really rate it very highly, and that's totally fine. Their biggest issue was like the Chaos Bag. They didn't really care for that, and a couple of other minor things. But they've updated their review for it now that there's so many more products out for it, and put out a new series of videos. Right now they just put out one video, but they've made it clear that there's more coming, where they claim to review every single Arkham Horror the card game product. And well, those of you who have played Arkham or who are fans of Arkham like we are, didn't take it very well. The review in parts was fair, but in most of it was very unfair or misrepresented, or, you know, they made major mistakes in their review, which can lead people who've never played the game to get a wrong idea as to what the game is and you know, all the aspects of it.
Well, I mean, they start the whole thing off by saying,
whilst we found it to be full of exciting ideas, the poor campaign structure, uninspired implementation of luck, and uninteresting card choices left us wanting for much more.
Yeah, they start off really bad, which we'll get into each of those points individually as we go through this discussion. But the first thing that I wanted to mention is, in the video title, they say, we review almost every Arkham Horror the card game product. And in the actual video itself, they say we review it's literally in the first 10 seconds, the guy says,
I just finished all of Arkham Horror the card game.
Literally everything. That's what they say. But then at 2 minutes in, immediately they're like, well, we didn't play the standalones and we didn't get the return to boxes. And it's like, wait a minute. Or I'm sorry, at 5 minutes in, they do that. And it's like, well, if you're going to do a review where you're claiming to review every product, you know, or at least in the video, not just in the title, say that you're reviewing most of the stuff, but there are things that you left out. But it's not until 5 minutes in the video where they say that they didn't review the standalones, and which there are 6 of if you include Labyrinths of Lunacy. So that's quite a few products that they've missed. And they also said that the Return to products, of which there are 3, so that's 9 total products out of the line of Arkham Horror. That's a significant chunk.
They dismissed them, right? They said, we heard on good authority the Return to series isn't very good. They just kind of instantly poo-pooed that.
We decided to omit the special standalone scenarios because they're a bit niche and hard to come by, and we're not covering the Return to expansions because, frankly, playing 19 more games of largely the same thing doesn't sound very productive, and we hear they're actually not very good.
And that's what I was going to get at. They literally said we didn't review it because we heard they weren't very good, which is crazy to me because, I kind of agree they're not great. They're probably the least compelling of the products. The whole purpose of an in-depth review is to help viewers determine if the rumors are true or if it's something that they want to buy. And by leaving those products out, they're doing a huge disservice, especially when they claim that they're reviewing everything Arkham Horror.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Nathan kind of touched on it best. Is it's not really so much that they didn't review the products themselves. It's more that they claim to like have this sort of objective standard when reviewing the game, but clearly they just kind of whoever told them that it wasn't good, they just took that at face value and didn't actually care to do diligence like they said they would.
Exactly. Just take someone's word for it that, it's not very good, so we might as well not review it. Mm-hmm. So starting off on their actual review, the very beginning at 2 minutes and 20 seconds in, they mentioned that you'll be losing a lot, and they say it kind of, in a bad way, but it is pretty on point. I mean, you do lose a lot in the game.
Each round you'll place Doom tokens on agenda cards until they eventually reach a threshold, advance, and introduce more nasty surprises. Advance too many and you've lost the game, which is a fair place to start because you will be losing a lot. Winning, on the other hand, is more nebulous.
But they're missing like a major aspect of the game that should be included in that comment when you're reviewing it. Because anyone who's not used to something like Arkham Horror, the card game, would immediately think that, well, you're just going to lose every single game and that's it. It's game over, end of everything. What they don't really explain until they briefly just glaze over it later in the video is that in Arkham Horror, when you lose, you don't really lose. I mean, that's just part of the game. When you lose, it's not game over. You take trauma and you continue the story. It just adds another element of the narrative to the story. You went insane temporarily and then you came back with a little bit of trauma. You got a major injury, but then you come back in the next scenario with a little trauma. There's not that many scenarios where when you lose, it's game over. And I think they really messed up on that when they said that in the very beginning of their review. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I think that it's strange because they say that winning is sort of nebulous, but then they lay out like clear objectives on how you're supposed to win the game. So I find it sort of confusing that they would kind of imply that like how you win the game is nebulous, but then go about explaining the conditions of how to win the game.
Well, to be fair though, what do they mostly review? They mostly review board games, right? And in most board games, it's get this many points, do this stuff. Whereas Matt Newman specifically said people are going to be thrown off at first because it's not always just beat the bad guy, get the thing, right? There's going to be times where you do as much as you can and then you can leave whenever you want. So, in fact, their argument is valid. It is not a clear-cut victory all the time. But that's part of the fun, right? That's part of the getting into the game and sussing out the victory conditions.
Yeah, but I think that's not to say that your objective isn't laid out when you set the scenario up, right? Like, if you take The Gathering as an instance, for instance, your objective is pretty clear from the second you read the act deck. It says, get enough clues to get out of the study. And then as you progress, you learn what each goal is.
Right.
I think ultimately you could really boil down most of the game to, fight the baddies, get the clues, and clear the objective.
To a degree, but if you're extending into a campaign mode, I kind of see where Nathan's going with this, and I kind of agree with both of you. They laid it out as a black and white thing, like winning is nebulous, but the game is a combination of a board game and a role-playing game. And a role-playing game, everybody who's played a role-playing game knows there are objectives in a role-playing game, but really the whole point of a role-playing game is narratives or cooperative storytelling. And I think this game kind of falls in that. It's not as open-ended as, say, Delta Green or Dungeons and Dragons or Call of Cthulhu. You can't just do whatever you want and go talk to, your neighbor or something like that. That doesn't happen in this game. But
well, that'd be awesome. Side quest, go talk to your neighbor. The door is ajar, there's blood on the floor. Damn it, I spent an experience points to talk to my neighbor thinking I'd just get some fat loot.
You should make a scenario called Side Point or Side Note Side Quest. I think that would
Scenario 1.5.
But, the whole point is that it's a combination of the two. So you're not just, you're telling a story. So even your investigator dying, you've told the story of how they perished, what happened. I think there's more to it than that. Like, it sparks imagination as you're playing of all the things that are occurring as the game is progressing. Unlike a board game that's mostly mechanics with a little bit of flavor, I think this is more on the high end of flavor, closer to a role-playing game, kind of a mix of the two, I think. At 6:45 into the video, they complain.
Couple that with any card worth its salt being very expensive and you constantly coming short on resources, and then couple that with cards frequently being one-use affairs that disappear like fleeting mirages of an oasis in a desert infested with giant tentacles.
My big gripe with this complaint is that it's a deck-building game. So these guys seem like they've played more than just board games. Like, these guys seem like they're familiar with deck-building games because on several of their past videos, they mentioned Magic the Gathering. So clearly they're familiar with deck building.
Yeah, and in this video, they mentioned Magic too.
Yeah, exactly. Even in this one, they did.
Yeah, that's weird because I don't call a Magic, Pokemon, or this game a deck builder because the deck building mechanic is like Dominion Ascension where you're building your deck as you play. Mm-hmm. This is just a game where you build your deck ahead of time. So that's kind of weird.
Like I would consider like Great Western Trail to be a deck building game, whereas like Arkham, you build a deck. Like, it's a whole different aspect of actually playing the game. Like, you're not, like, deck building isn't a part of actually physically playing the game. It's just a part of.
It's it's not entirely all about the deck building. I see what you mean.
Right, yeah.
But my whole point is they're making a huge point to say that, the good cards you're never going to be able to play because they're too expensive to play and all this stuff. But, their whole channel leads me to believe that they should understand the concept of resource management and cost curve of your deck. Almost every deck building game has some kind of resource management or cost curve, like Magic the Gathering certainly does, right? So I would think that they would catch on that if you're finding yourself running low on resources all the time, maybe it's not a game problem, but a bad deck or a deck that needs to be tweaked. So I feel, again, that's an unfair representation.
I wonder if they just used starter deck examples. They didn't go into what decks they used, right?
Well, I mean, agreed, but they went into the review saying that they're reviewing the game as a whole, and a large part of the game, a large part of the community online definitely really enjoys the deck building aspect of the game. So that's not a small part of the game by any means. Sure, it's only a part of it because the scenarios are the other part, but the deck building is a decent chunk. I would say at least a third of the fun of the game for a lot of people.
So you're bringing up the cards and the fact that they're expensive, etc. But I want to hear from Nate or Man from Lang with this quote.
And the cards themselves feel particularly uninspired. Yes, there's tools in here that might excite you, but if you compare the cleverness of card design to other collectible card games, then in the words of Courtney Barnett, these feel pedestrian at best.
Even if you didn't love a game, to play that much of it and see that there's that big of a community, but I kind of like the people as they reviewed stuff. They definitely had some charisma, and they did have some good points, and they did know how to pace out a video. All of that I actually thought was really good, but it seems like it's almost like a food critic that really enjoys ways of putting food down. They really get off on that and using the words. I mean, using things like, I wrote down several words: uninspired, pedestrian, lackluster, lackadaisical, thoughtless, unimaginative. I mean, they said a lot of these words, careless, throughout the entire judge. It seems that they were really trying to almost elevate themselves in their review style by saying words that were really cutting and hurting. And a lot of times that wasn't needed because they talked about the positives. So once again, the cards are uninspired and pedestrian at best. Nate or Man from Lang, what do you think of that quote?
Well, I think it's. I mean, I've enjoyed No Pun Included's reviews in the past, and I guess I'd have to say I'm sad or disappointed by this one. Not so much because of what they had to say, but just because of a lot of the seemingly unforced errors in the review. Talking about specific cards, like I think there's at one point they're talking about how you can put Dario in a Mark Harrigan deck.
If you play as Mark Harrigan the soldier, then your deck will feature such items as a trusty police buddy, a trusty dog, a trusty 45 automatic, and a trusty buddy named Dario.
Which is not true. And then they have, I think it's the Derringer. They can say you can use your agility instead of your combat to fight with it, which isn't true. They talk about how Lola is a great solo investigator, which I would strongly disagree with. And then the cards being uninspired, these cards are based on sort of 1920s tropes, so I'm not sure what kind of cards they would expect. We have things like leather coat and trench coat and, the weapons that were of the time, flashlight. Like I'm not sure what kind of cards they want or they sort of expect the game to have.
Yeah, that's how I feel too. And I think that comment was kind of more specifically made at the core set cards, which also kind of makes me scratch my head a little bit because you want the core set cards to be simple to understand so that you can, understand the game and play it properly. Sure, some cards may not be the most exciting to look at face value, but that, yeah, I think that criticism kind of comes off, I guess, disingenuously. It doesn't. I'm not really sure what they're trying to say by saying that the cards are uninspired or pedestrian.
Well, if they're referring to the base game cards, the quote, "I wouldn't recommend the Arkham Horror Living Card Game base to anyone," came up.
Yeah, I was going to get to that, but we can talk about it. That was their recommendation was to not recommend the core set. What do you guys think?
Yeah, and when they say that, they make a kind of snide remark that you have to buy the core set in order to play the game, and it's I'm not really sure what they were expecting out of the core set. It kind of makes me feel like they had some sort of expectation, kind of sort of false expectation going into it to begin with. And I think part of it is that when they did their most recent video, they already didn't like the core set to begin with. So it kind of feels like they're trying to draw blood out of a stone, so to speak, with the core set. At least in their own opinion anyway. I personally don't feel that the core set is a bad product to purchase. It makes a lot of sense. I think Nathan said it in one of our most recent episodes about how the core set was priced at a particular point to make it more accessible to players on a financial perspective. While, yes, it is unfortunate that you have to buy 2 to play with it with 4 people, it is worthwhile in the long run, I think, for somebody that likes to play the game. And I think the scenarios are good, too. I do agree with their assessment on the difficulty level of the core set, as it does very clearly ramp up in difficulty pretty extremely from scenarios 2 to 3.
Yeah, it was sadly completely accurate.
I was going to mention that because that's part of why they said they don't recommend it. They say that the ramp, not the difficulty of all the scenarios, but the ramp up in difficulty from one to the next is pretty harsh. But I think it's a crazy comment because honestly, it's one of the best selling games out there right now. So clearly there's some kind of disconnect because, they're saying that it's selling because of the expansions. I don't know if that's what they think, but it's easy to remind them if you're a fan of Arkham Horror that, they themselves said that it's required to play the game, to buy the core set. And so clearly if the game is so popular, there are quite a few people that did like the core set. Not just that, but I agree with you guys and I agree with them on the difficulty ramp. Definitely is something that is not great. It can throw some people off. But they also said that none of the scenarios are very good. But I kind of disagree with that. If you ask most people what their top 3 scenarios are, you get a lot of people saying that Midnight Masks is, or if you say top 5 scenarios, Midnight Mask is going to come up over and over and over again. It's a very beloved scenario still to this day.
Yeah, I went back and I watched their first video, and it's pretty clear that they had a very mixed reaction to the core set, and they didn't really like it and couldn't recommend it. And one of the reasons for that was because they disliked the Chaos Bag mechanic. And so when seeing that and then seeing them come back to re-review the game, I sort of just asked myself, why are they bothering to re-review the game when one of the primary mechanics, which they disliked, the Chaos Bag, is still there? Their reason for disliking the game in the first place hasn't changed.
Well, they said they basically reversed their judgment on the Chaos Bag. They quite clearly took a minute to be like, we didn't like this at first, but it grew on us.
They said Dunwich made them change their mind because you add tokens throughout certain scenarios, like in the middle of the scenario, and they like that aspect of it.
But I also got the impression from them that they're basically saying once you learn I think they make the point that once you learn how to game the Chaos Bag, the game falls apart. Once you know what you need to pass a test, then the game, so basically they're saying the game is too hard, and then once you learn how to game the Chaos Bag, it's too easy because I need a -2, so I'll just manage to pump my test to -2 to +2, and then I pass. Okay, now I'm just cruising through this scenario, easy peasy. And to me, I like the Chaos Bag mechanic because part of it is gaming the Chaos Bag and trying to mitigate the amount of risk that you're engaging in. And sure, there are going to be times when you're unable to do that, and you're going to have to take a test that's not that you would prefer not to take, but the game is constantly forcing them on you.
Right. I think we can all agree that their comments and their discoveries are part of a chart, right? Because I think a lot of people, when they very first start playing, are thrown off maybe by how hard the game can be. They're thrown off by using the Chaos Bag. So that was their initial reactions, like, whoa, right? And then they're like, well, hold on a second. The Chaos Bag's actually not that bad. It's kind of cool. We can totally game it. Because I think a lot of people feel that right away when they start passing some tests or getting some synergies with their cards. But over time, you get to that almost earned wisdom from failures and successes of, sure, you can quote-unquote game the bag for a while, but you're going to have streaks of bad luck and you're going to have streaks of good luck, and there's always the instant fail. So I don't think they reviewed that third evolution of thought, if that makes sense.
That does make sense, and I totally can see where you're coming from, or where that mentality that you're putting yourself in their minds there. As a new player, if you just happen to buy that and you're playing and you have no idea what you're getting yourself into, it can throw you off. But at the same time, if you're buying a game called Arkham Horror, you kind of know a little bit more what you're getting yourself into, which it's going to bring me to my next point.
You're thrust into the shoes of an incompetent buffoon that is surrounded by otherworldly monsters desperately searching for anything that is remotely in any way, shape or form useful.
I don't know where they're getting that from. I mean, it's like if anyone who's read horror books, watched horror movies, horror shows, this game is exactly presented in the same way. It's horror. That's how it works. You're a regular person who's been thrust into a situation where like unimaginable horrors are suddenly thrown at you and they're a reality that you didn't even know existed. And suddenly you're scrambling for a way out or a way to defeat them. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're an incompetent buffoon. And just as an example to throw in there, any movie or show, like, you know, those of you who've watched it, right? So were the kids in the Losers Club incompetent buffoons because they were trying to...
Spoilers.
Yeah, I haven't spoiled anything. So were the kids in the Losers Club incompetent buffoons because they're trying to figure out a way to either, you know, get away from this thing or fight this thing, right? Was Ripley from Alien an incompetent buffoon because she was scared and screaming and maybe suffered some mental trauma initially when she found out there was an alien creature and all the Space Marines who were badasses all got killed? Like, and that is a spoiler. Sorry about that. It's a horror game. Just like any horror story that's being told, there are things that are stacked against you, and it doesn't mean that you're a stumbling buffoon. I mean, I think that was such a major misrepresentation of the character.
Well, hold on. That's what it gets back to my original point I was saying earlier. I think they were trying to get illicit reactions by saying very, very slamming comments instead of like, hey, you know, it kind of feels like this. Nope, it's like, bam, worst idea ever. Don't recommend this to anyone. They go to extremes, I think, because either they think in extremes or they're trying to elicit certain reactions from the audience. And they got reactions, right?
Definitely.
Yeah, I mean, we're here making this podcast episode about this video, so
maybe we're the guinea pigs and they're the scientists.
What do you guys feel about the incompetent buffoon comment? I personally took I was taken aback by that comment when they talked about the investigators being incompetent buffoon, that you're just playing an incompetent buffoon in this game where you don't stand a chance.
I just felt like when they said that we were being thrust into the shoes of an incompetent buffoon, that like they were talking about themselves in that particular instance.
Oh, you felt like they were? No, well, or you're saying that...
I was trying to make a joke.
Oh. I was going to say that...
that joke just like flew over the landing spot, though, sadly. But to be more serious though about your point, yeah, I mean, it's just kind of like, I think it's more like what Nathan said. You know, they're just using words to elicit a response out of the viewer. You know, and I think it's more just kind of the grandiose YouTubing kind of style that a lot of reviewers have. I think Shut Up and Sit Down kind of does that sort of thing where they use a myriad of words to describe a pretty basic concept. Yeah, I don't know. It's kind of strange. I do feel like the investigators of Arkham are generally pretty competent people, like from a role-playing perspective, but it's kind of more of a nitpick in their whole video, I feel.
I guess the only thing that would concern me is that if they leave the impression with people who watch it, who pick up the core set, and their complaints about the core set are perfectly legitimate, and I think FFG recognized that when they released Marvel Champions and they included a full set of cards in the game. But when they sort of suggest that the investigators that you play are not very good, I think that leaves I mean, sure, you can say, you look at Wendy, right, and say, oh, she's got one combat, she's not very good. Well, I mean, I've built and played a deck that can kill the experiment with her. So, looks can be deceiving. So I think that the investigators are quite competent and quite able to do, pretty much anything that you would like to do with them, given, if you build a deck with them, and that's part of the game, right, is building a deck.
Mm-hmm. And I think that this review, like, entirely misses that aspect of it. I think maybe Nathan said it earlier, but it seems like they just kind of took the starter decks of whatever investigator they picked and just went with it.
Well, they didn't talk about how building decks differently changes things drastically. Right? They didn't touch on that. What they did say...
To add insult to the very robust injury of a game system that frequently renders you ineffective, your deck is designed to work against you.
And it's interesting because I've always looked at it as, in real life, people have triggers. People have PTSD, anxiety. People have issues or experiences in their life that make them that unique person, right? So they didn't talk about how a majority of the deck is stuff to help you. But just like real life, the deck represents a person. It represents their life. And there are things that come up and you have to deal with them. And I think that's a really, what's the word I'm looking for? It's not even, it's sublime aspect of the game. It's really cool how that comes out. But they didn't kind of get into that, which is once again, not necessarily their fault since they're not diehard fans of the game. But they also didn't play enough to kind of get to that realization of the chaos bag. They didn't get to that point where they felt that the characters were not just, buffoons or whatever. They didn't get to that point where they talked about the deck construction and how that makes a difference.
But in a deck building game where a huge part of it is deck building, I mean, that you would think they would cover that a little bit more. Now, the deck working against you, since you mentioned that, like you just mentioned, maybe they should have delineated it where if you were using the starter decks, maybe, but again, if the deck is working against you, there's only one person to blame since you built the deck, right? So,
well, I think it just goes back to the first review where they really didn't like the weakness mechanic. And I think that's when they talk about your deck working against you, they're referring there primarily to the weakness mechanic and how you can you start a campaign off with at least 2 weaknesses, and then you'll be adding more weaknesses throughout the campaign. Now, weaknesses can certainly, some weaknesses are more debilitating than others, but generally speaking, to say that because you have one or 2 cards in a 30 card deck that are negative cards, that your deck is suddenly ill prepared to tackle a scenario is
not just ill prepared, actively working against you the entire deck.
I think that's not the case, I think. Nobody likes to draw a weakness, certainly, when you could draw. They tax your card draw and prevent you from getting the things that you need, but a lot of the time you draw them and deal with them and move on.
And one thing they did get right, he said...
And if you haven't failed, that's a heck of a moment, because you'll feel like you've climbed Mount Everest, even though all you've actually done is just busted down a door without, breaking your elbow.
When you don't fail, you feel like you've climbed Mount Everest. And I feel like there, for a moment at least, they got it. They got what the game is about. That feeling when you actually succeed on something that you really had very little chance of succeeding on, or the odds were stacked against you. You do feel like you climbed Mount Everest, right? That's, I think, what a lot of people love about this game, when they're able to pull something off like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and part of that is gaming the bag too, right? Like if you like going to our previous comments about how the bag is generally like you want to be +2 on a standard bag up, and you can create those situations for yourself, right? Like by playing smart, you can, put yourself in a situation where, well, if I draw anything, other than the 0 or a +1, I lose. And sure enough, like you've set yourself up to have those lucky draws.
What are your... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
But I was just going to say, like they make multiple examples, like Man from Lang said earlier, about, the wrong cards being in the wrong deck. And it just kind of, to me, like did they perhaps miss something? I'm not really... It's hard to grasp, because they don't even touch on deck building at all. So
yeah. We're going to get to some of the harsher things in just a second.
The penultimate adventure in the campaign presents an opportunity to lose the entire campaign. This concept seems to pervade through all future campaigns as well, meaning that if you didn't succeed, you were barred access from playing the last scenario in the campaign. A bit of a bummer if you paid 12 quid for it and have to play 7 scenarios all over again just to have a chance at having a go. Of course, you could cheat and say that you have won, or you could play it in standalone mode. But both of those options feel a little bit cheap.
What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think it's a difference between, say, Where Doom Awaits was a very controversial scenario when it was released. And I think that's probably the most egregious example of it, where, you fail that and your campaign ends. Now, other campaigns, your investigator can die, but the campaign doesn't necessarily end.
Mm-hmm. Right, like your investigator is killed or driven insane, but you can still continue the campaign.
You just pick up another investigator and you're good to go. Like, I'm trying to think of other instances where the campaign simply ends.
I think Black Stars Rise.
Black Stars Rise is another one, yeah.
I want to be careful mentioning these specific things just because, as much as I joke about spoilers, I don't want to mention exact scenarios where you can end the campaign because there's people that are playing that don't know.
True, good point. But they did mention it in their review regarding one of them being the penultimate one for Dunwich. I agreed with them there. I was thinking I wish some scenarios didn't just outright do that. I 100% agree with them, because it's like if you bought the whole campaign as one, and then you suddenly realize that you can't play the last one to continue your current story, you'd have to replay everything or just play it as a standalone. It is disheartening.
Has anyone here played Doom, the video game?
Yeah.
Did you ever play God mode?
What's that?
Did you ever play God mode on Doom, where all of a sudden you could just walk through walls and kill everything and nothing hurt you?
No.
Well, it's kind of like playing poker without money. You're just like, oh, okay, whatever. I do feel like campaign ending scenarios or permadeaths or really hard scenarios give the victory its bittersweet win. I do feel like when you really suffer, just like in Lovecraftian stories, when you really experience difficult scenarios or game enders and being punched in the gut when your character is removed a few, scenarios in, I think it feels that much better when you win.
I think my main issue with it is not so much that the existence of these scenarios, it's that I think they have a certain perspective on replayability that I don't share. They seem to view that, okay, so we played this scenario and we lost, so we have to replay the entire campaign. And to do anything else would be cheating. And I disagree with that. Like, I will play the same scenario a dozen times. If you want to play a better, the next scenario, just replay the one you
just
are.
Hit F9. I don't understand.
Like, I don't understand I can understand where they feel like, okay, it would be cheating if we just played this again, but why not? It's your game. You can play it however you want.
Is it? Is it cheating though?
I see both your points. I actually do not play it again. I restart a campaign from scratch.
Yeah, and that's a perfectly legitimate way of doing it, but I don't think it's one that everyone shares. Some people will say, okay, I failed this campaign, so I'm going to have to start at square one. Other people like me will say, okay, I failed this scenario, so I'm going to play it again and possibly again and again until I achieve a certain level of success, and then I'll move on.
Yeah, and I really only do that, if I'm playing off camera and I want to try a deck out, or I want to, go through a campaign. I was playing solo Carolyn through Return to Dunwich, and again, I was at Where Doom Awaits, and yeah, there was just one particular instance. I just drew nothing but enemies and got bogged down, and I was like, yeah, I'm just gonna restart this and try it again. And I managed to beat it, and it didn't feel like a hollow victory to me, so I don't agree with the premise.
Especially when you get very unlucky. I mean, at times it's like, no, that was way too unlucky. Let's play it where it would have been a normal pull of bad things, you know, not an overwhelming amount of bad things. Because that can happen, right? You lose in 2 rounds and it's like, okay, come on. Let's do this again.
Yeah, and maybe that's just because most of us are solo players. So, you know, there isn't a group of people that we're held to a standard with, so to speak. You know, like in a multiplayer group, I think it might be harder to convince them to try to replay the scenario or something. If, you know, one person is of Nathan's opinion and they don't want to do it, then you might have a harder time convincing them to do that. But yeah, I find it strange that they don't find the scenarios to be replayable, because they make a point.
If I replay a scenario to get a better outcome, that's not fun. I'm just applying past mistakes to make the right decisions. But those right decisions no longer pose a challenge. I'm just breezing through it.
What? Like, what the fuck?
I could play the freaking The Gathering. I could play The Gathering at a moment's notice, and that's, you could argue, the most jejune simple of all of the adventures, but the replay with different decks and different outcomes,
different number of players. I mean, you bring up really good points, and I think that goes back to the narrative storytelling, role playing aspect of it. You know, if you're not seeing the game in that way, if you're seeing it as just mechanics, maybe, but even then, there's still an argument for, yeah, it's still replayable. But if you're
and don't forget
the
the Return to the Night of the Zealot. Boom, mic dropped.
Nice.
Well, just one final point on that. I sort of feel like when I listen to them talk about the replayability of scenarios and how campaigns are supposed to unfold, I sort of feel like, you know, they want to experience the story. That is their primary interest in the game.
Yeah.
And so they want to be able to play it once, and they want to be able to succeed, and they want to be able to have a conclusion. And so any barrier to that is considered bad. So I think that's where they're like, they want to be able to play it once, they want to be able to succeed, and they want to be able to say, okay, we finished the Dunwich Legacy campaign in one go. We didn't have to replay anything. We didn't have to go back, etc., etc.
Yeah, I got that too.
I just think they're going about it the wrong way in terms of experiencing the story, because I don't have the timestamp for it, but in part of the video they mentioned that the trope's been overdone, the Lovecraft has been overdone, and all this stuff. So clearly they're very familiar with Lovecraft at this point, is what they're, you know, claiming to say. So then they should know that in most of Lovecraft stories, the protagonist doesn't really win. They go insane, they get killed, or whatever happens, you know? It's just they're narrating their experience with the mythos. So whether you win or lose, quote, end quote, the story still got told. You go from the beginning of the campaign to the end, and a story was told about how Azathoth came and, you know, just woke up and just everything disappeared and was destroyed. But I think that they don't grasp that concept.
Well, I think there's a point where Elaine makes the point that it's time for the Arkham Horror games in general to just do away with that.
The tropes of Lovecraft.
That whole losing, the game is against you, you're going to lose sort of thing.
But now more than ever, the campaign structure of The Path to Carcosa made me realise that maybe it's time for Arkham to unburden itself of this tired old robe.
Okay, Lola. You touched on it earlier, man, from Lang. At 20 minutes and 11 seconds in the video, they go into Lola Hayes.
Enter stage fright Lola Hayes, a character that lets you dip into the entire card pool without restriction, whereas usual characters can only select from 2 of the game's 5 colours. Although she has other restrictions. Lola Hayes is an actress, and as such, much like celebrities who have played doctors, she can accomplish anything like spinal surgery.
Yeah, I think this is one of the unforced errors that they make, and I think it just shows their their unfamiliarity with the game. And certainly if I was to pick up the Path to Carcosa, and I mean, I played Lola as soon as she was spoiled, and to suggest that Lola is a great solo investigator because she has access to the entire card pool is it's misleading, right? Lola is is probably the most, if not the most difficult investigator to play in any format, and she is particularly difficult in solo because she does not have particularly good skills. She can have all the access to the cards she wants, but the way her mechanics works makes her very difficult to play. You have access to all those cards, but you cannot play all those cards. And she is an investigator that many people bounce off of pretty hard, and they don't want to play her. And I feel the same way. You know, I completely understand why people don't want to play her, because she can be headache inducing, because you have to really think hard when you play her. You have to be not only thinking about this turn, but you have to be thinking about a turn ahead, which is not the case with many of the other investigators. And so to sort of hold up Lola and say that, okay, if you thought playing they sort of, and at the same time they sort of say, well, there's Ashcan Pete and then there's Lola. And I'm like, give me Ashcan Pete any day over Lola. Yeah. Thank you very much. You know,
And Lola's not just hard to play because she's, hard to be successful with. She's also hard to play because she has very advanced mechanics. Like, you have to know your timing windows. You have to plan that properly, switch roles. There's a lot more to keep track of when you play as Lola. And, Matt Astrophic, a member of the community, he has his own YouTube channel. He almost exclusively plays Lola, and he has figured her out, but that's a very rare exception. Lola is definitely an advanced investigator, and even people who are really good at the game don't like using her.
Yeah, mechanically, she's a lot more sophisticated than the other investigators. Like you say, you need to know your timing windows, and I guess if you have just picked up the core set and you have read the Learn to Play guide, timing windows are not in the Learn to Play guide. You have to read the rules reference to gain that. So if you pick up Lola, just having played the core set, you are in for a bad time.
Yeah, and they make a misrepresentation with that too. They say you can have any card from any card pool without restriction, and that's not true. There is restrictions. You have to have a minimum of 7 cards from at least 3 card pools, right? Something like that. So there's restrictions. I mean, that's misrepresented there as well.
Mm-hmm. And it's funny too, because when they're talking about Pete and they're talking about Lola, they mention how in a solo game, you're forced to do pretty much everything, and that it's better to be a master at something than to be a generalist at everything. But that's exactly what Lola is. She's a generalist at everything.
Yeah.
It's kind of like Jenny in that regard. Her 3 stats kind of limit what she could do, and her deck building is much more of a chore than I think it is a boon for a lot of beginning players.
Yeah, I think using Lola was a very bad choice on their part, just because she's very sophisticated and it's not quite as simple as just you get all the cards. You can play with all the cards. There's a lot more to it than that. And people who see that and say, okay, well, if I was having trouble with the core set and I pick up Path to Carcosa so I can play Lola,
all my woes will be answered.
Yeah, that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's also a little bit of they haven't played it as much as we have moved, because on the surface, if you're like, oh, I can play a variety of cards, that's different than, okay, wait a second, Crisis of Identity. Wait, hold on, back up just a moment.
Yeah, it was a very strange choice, especially when they, like you said, they had Ashcan Pete right there. You could have just said something along the lines of, well, Pete isn't very good at fighting himself, but with his ally Duke, he is. And, they could have, gone into detail at that point about how, you could have built an entire deck around Pete and Duke and, his ability to discard cards to ready Duke again. And It's very strange. They decide to go with the most complicated misleading investigator in the entire game.
And I agreed with all of that. I really didn't. It was well said. I don't know if anyone caught it, but I thought it was interesting. I don't know the gentleman's name. I think it's interesting that he launched into this really... He made it a lot bigger than it had to be, but when he was like, another thing that bothers me in the Carcosa campaign.
This lackadaisical approach to mental health issues continues as we explore the scenarios further. Soon we discover an enemy type, which is simply a person that has the tag lunatic. A term that's out of place now, and as revealed by a minimal amount of research, wasn't that widely used at the time when this game was set either.
Now, granted, I like Possessed just a tiny bit more, but at the same time, it's not that far removed, and you could have just said, hey, he said this, it was a little trope or whatever, but, this might have been cooler, instead of just, once again, going for those words that were to elicit a reaction and just be hurtful. I don't know, I felt that was unnecessary.
Well, the game is a horror game about people who go insane when they try to comprehend otherworldly entities that are beyond our comprehension. If it was a game that was seriously attempting to address the mental health issues of our day, and they included things like lunatic, then obviously I would not support that. But this is a horror game that talks about insanity. And so I'm not too sure. I mean, I know they've discussed this in other reviews as well, where they have tackled the sort of appropriateness of the subject matter. And sure, I mean, you can make that argument, but to me, it seems somewhat misplaced here because, I mean, the game is not trying to be accurate to mental health concerns. It's a horror game about insanity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm right there with you, man. From like I don't disagree. Like, there's really nothing to disagree about. Like, it's just his opinion, and he's like not wrong for having that opinion, I guess. But like Nathan was saying earlier, is that he tends to like make these really kind of like just snide remarks. Like, he says that he's not going to bash the developers because other developers don't take the same sort of caution, which to me just feels pretty backhanded.
He was referring to the amount of research they did because the word lunatic wasn't widely used. But the word still existed, so he made a big point.
Yeah, which is just not true, frankly. I mean, sure, it may not have been used in the UK where where no pun included is from, but that word was a legal word up until 2012 in the United States, so it was most certainly used, and especially in that time era. It's kind of like they nitpick that word, but they don't nitpick the word asylum. It's just strange, and I think what Man from Lang said kind of encapsulates it perfectly. Like, it just feels misplaced. It's like the game, like Man from Lang said, it's about horror and it's about dealing with insanity, and it's not trying to tackle social political issues like that.
Do you think, Nathan, that, because they mention that basically madness is whittled down to some punchlines, quote unquote, do you think that the game puts madness in that light, where they're just punchlines for part of the game?
I mean, you could argue both sides. Overall, no. At times they do apply it, but also to add context and flavor for the scenario. That kind of pulls me into one more comment I wanted to make, though, about lunatics / madness when they talked about the Carcosa campaign. I'm pretty darn sure, if I remember correctly, that most people like the Carcosa campaign, if not as their favorite, as one of their favorites. And they said that it was fairly unimaginative, and the choices are random puzzles that don't come together. And they kind of liked how the different pathways went as far as what you chose, but that when you did choose one, you were then beaten in the face and pummeled and stopped. So once again, I feel like that is all accurate if you're very new to the game and to the scenario, and that's your first impression, and you give up. If that makes any sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Before
That to
we
me
go-
sounds like they went conviction and then they had to play Phantom of Truth. No, maybe I'm wrong, but that's like that was kind of the implication that I got from that comment.
His character weakness is shell shock, and his unique card is a picture of who we presume is his ex-partner that he looks at whilst he physically hurts himself to push further. These are two serious mental health conditions, and whilst I absolutely believe that games should explore serious subjects like mental health, Arkham reduces everything to a punchline.
When they made that comment about, mental health being a punchline, they said it in reference to Mark Harrigan and his mechanics, how he hurts himself in order to, when he remembers his sweetheart or family member or daughter, whatever she is to him. So
It's his wife, I believe.
Yeah,
But
or his wife.
Anyway,
in the context of Mark Harrigan is where they mentioned the punchline thing. So do you think that that's changed now? Do you think that you still agree with that, with some of what they said there? Or do you think that, I think the Mark Harrigan thing is handled with tact. I don't think that it is a punchline at all, but what are your thoughts on it?
I mean, I think that anything that is in Arkham Horror, the card game, that's along those lines, I think no matter what it is, they're going to see it that way, and I don't think there's any amount of argument that you could make that would change their opinion otherwise. I mean, that being said, I agree with you, Face. I don't think it is. To bring back the specific example of Mark Harrigan, his whole backstory is that he's a soldier from World War I, and that his weakness is supposed to be a representation of, what he saw in the war. And I don't see how that's a punchline. Like, it's not like supposed to be a comedic thing in the game, and the game isn't really like funny. So I just don't understand where that comes from.
There are horrible situations that are so over the top they can be comical.
Yeah,
but they're
so-
not presented in a comical way. Just as a player, sometimes I find it like hilarious that you're, beaten and beaten and beaten to a pulp, but that's not the game making fun of it or, making it a joke or anything. So, Nathan, you mentioned the path to Carcosa. Man from Lang, do you think that's that hard of a campaign
No,
as they presented it?
no. I mean, there's so many variables that go into it. I mean, I've always enjoyed the Path to Carcosa campaign when I've played it, and I think it has a lot of interesting choices to make. Again, I think their primary complaint comes down to they want to experience the story and succeed. And the path they chose, they did not succeed. And so then they went back and read the other choices and went, oh, if we'd gone this way, it would have been so much easier. It's just like, well, you could replay it, but I get the impression that that's not what they want to have to do. They want to succeed on their first attempt and move on.
Well, I mean, they even kind of clearly state that in the beginning of the review when they say that,
Remember, we do this so you don't have to. If you're interested in Arkham Horror, the card game, thanks to our diligence, you'll know exactly which cycles you should get.
which I think really kind of paints a pretty biased perspective on your review if you're just going to say like, oh, well, we're going to play all these once and then we're going to poo-poo it and then that's going to be it. It's like, but like the issues that you have, you could just replay the scenarios, but
I mean, if they had seen the Discord thread about ahead of the Iron Man, when people did the Path to Carcosa Iron Man, and people had developed spreadsheets to figure out the best path to go through. And some people chose conviction and some people chose doubt, and they had their reasons for doing that. And they had, I can't remember which way we ended up going, but, we said, well, we want to make one scenario easier, so let's go and do it this way. Other groups, they said, no, that scenario is fine for us, but we want to achieve this other goal. So they went another way. And I think the beauty of that campaign is there are so many different ways that you can approach it, and all of them are legitimate.
Do you think that part of their thoughts about the difficulty are because they think there's one, or they thought of it as being just one right way to go? And since they love Dunwich, and Dunwich is pretty linear, pretty straightforward, there aren't a lot of choices that you make that are going to, other than you get to decide which scenario you play first, whether it's the casino or the other one. But there aren't too many choices that'll veer you to completely different, divergent storylines or parts of the story. Do you think that played a big role in their thoughts about Path to Carcosa as far as its difficulty?
It's possible. I mean, Dunwich is very much more linear than Carcosa is, and there are fewer choices to make. I mean, there are a few in Dunwich that can affect the long-term outcome of the campaign, but I think the choices are amplified in Path to Carcosa by quite a bit. It'll be interesting. I'm curious to see what they have to say about
TFA,
something like the Forgotten Age, where your choices at the beginning can have a huge impact on how the campaign unfolds.
Yeah, they're probably gonna hate that campaign.
If they dislike Path to Carcosa as much as they say they do, then I cannot see them enjoying Forgotten Age
In the slightest, yeah. I feel like they're gonna hate almost every portion of it.
Man. Now watch when they put that one out, they're gonna be like, it was the best. It was
Well, they should at least try one of the return twos too, and maybe for Dunwich Legacy, just to see what it does different. But I don't know if they'll play it anymore.
No, because they heard it wasn't very good. Yeah, I don't know. So overall, what are your thoughts, like your final thoughts regarding this review? Was it fair? Do you think that clearly we all kind of agree that it wasn't 100% fair, but what parts did you like best, or what parts did you disagree with the most?
Well, I think for me, their criticisms of the core set are fair, I think. And I think it's hard to say. Like, I feel like they had some sort of like expectation going into the game, and then they weren't meeting that expectation, and the game disappointed them in that regard. And I'm sort of at a loss of how to feel about it, but I guess mostly just disappointed.
What about you, Man from Lane?
I've always enjoyed Efka and Elaine's work on a lot of their videos, and whenever I see a new No Pun Included review, I always watch it, and I tend to enjoy them. I think this is the first time I've actually seen them review a game that I've enjoyed or that I've played seriously, and so it was, I guess, I think at the beginning I said it was sad and disappointing, and not so much because of what they had to say. I mean, there are problems with the core set. I agree with that. There are problems if you run into these scenarios that end the game and you don't like that. I can completely understand those issues. I guess I found it disappointing more because the errors that they made in the review regarding some of the card interactions and whatnot suggests to me that they've made similar errors in other reviews that I haven't played the game, and so it sort of means all of their reviews now I have to treat with suspicion. I'm like, okay, I enjoyed this review, but do they actually know what they're talking about? And based on their review of Arkham Horror, I can't say that anymore. Like, my trust in them as reviewers has been somewhat diminished, I guess, and that's what I find disappointing more than anything they had to say about the game itself. I mean, what they have to say isn't going to change my feelings towards the game. I mean, I've played hundreds of games, and I'll probably play hundreds of games more. and I will continue to introduce the game to friends, and the people who I have introduced it to have enjoyed it. But when I watch their reviews in the future, I'll be like, okay, this was really good, but did they get it right? And based on their Arkham Horror review, where they clearly did not get some things right, I'll have to watch with a much more critical eye, I think.
Nathan, what are your thoughts?
No, and I agree. I mean, whenever somebody pokes big holes in one of your games, not from an emotional standpoint, but from a logical standpoint, you're like, oh, I don't know how much I can trust them. I get that. Overall, I thought they had good coverage of the game mechanics, the way they went over how to play and they kind of set it up and talked about it. I was refreshingly surprised. I was like, okay, a lot of that makes sense. I appreciate how they explained this, or how they showed this with pictures and the camera, and they had good humor. But I don't think you could take them for face value like Man from Lang was saying when they said we've done a really in-depth review of this. I think a lot of their reviews should be seen as just casual reviews where you get at least a taste or flavor of the game. But I couldn't build a building on that foundation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think my final thoughts on it, I wish that they would have, with a game that's this popular, at least, not every game, but with a game that's as popular as Arkham Horror is, that they would have at least kind of felt the temperature with the rest of the actual Arkham Horror communities, so they can get a better idea regarding things like recommending Lola as a solo investigator, or the difficulty of certain campaigns, because there is a chance. I mean, it's a common question in most of the threads, whether it be Facebook, Reddit, Discord, where a new player is always asking, am I doing this wrong? Am I playing this the right way? And I feel like they clearly have played certain things wrong. Maybe they should have gotten a little bit of advice on that as well. But, poo-pooing certain things, specifically Path to Carcosa, when over 90% of the community, really feels that that's one of the top 3, some even say the top campaign overall in the entire game. And as far as difficulty, one of the easiest ones, I feel like they maybe should have gotten a feel for those kind of aspects of the game from the rest of the community before making those kind of recommendations. Because you can make a review in 2 ways. You can make a review as if you were a brand new player and experiencing it as it's coming to you, and say, and then as a new player, you might watch that review and be like, oh, this is how I would feel playing this game. Cool. That would be a little bit more acceptable, I think. But they didn't come at it from that direction. They came at it from the direction of, here's our expert opinion as expert reviewers of board games. This is the game. This is how it is. This is the difficulty, blah, 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 blah. And when they approached it in that direction, since they didn't get a feel for it from the rest of the community, I think they ended up with a very, very faulty review.
Yeah, I think one of the other final issues that kind of worries me about this series of campaigns is that it seems to be attempt to rank the campaigns on some sort of basis, which seems sort of confusing to me, because the campaigns are very different, by and large. Dunwich offers a very different experience from Carcosa, and Carcosa offers a very different experience from TFA, and I think that trying to, quote, find the best campaign or the best expansion is sort of a fool's errand, right? What is the best for one person, what is the best for another is going to depend, very wildly on your circumstances. So I just feel like the review's kind of coming at it from a really strange and I would say wrong direction.
Well, I think that's a good point. I think when I sort of watched it at the beginning, it sort of seemed to me that the reason for re-reviewing it was to say, okay, we didn't give this a good review in the first place, but it seems really popular, so we're going to re-review it again. We are going to play it all, and we are going to tell you, if you want to play this, which is the best campaign to pick. And if you look at it strictly from that perspective, you're going to be missing a lot of the player cards. because the player cards come out in each expansion pack. So there are cards in those packs that are going to help. Like if you play Mystics without any of the cards from Dunwich Legacy, you're going to have a tough time because there are some great Mystic cards. There are great cards for every class in that campaign. So if you simply ignore it and say, okay, they said this campaign was bad, so I'm not going to buy any of the products from that campaign, then you're missing out on all the player cards from that campaign as well. Same with Path to Carcosa. It's like, okay, they basically shredded Path to Carcosa and said it's bad. Okay, so nobody buys it. Okay, so nobody buys the player cards that may actually be helpful. I'd have to bring up a list and look at the player cards, but I imagine there are some pretty fantastic player cards in that set. I mean, one that comes to mind, Stick to the Plan. I mean, I can't imagine playing Guardians without Stick to the Plan.
Key of Ys is in Path to Carcosa too. So
Key of Ys, if you just ignore all those packs and say, well, I'm not going to buy them because these reviewers told me this campaign was bad, then you're missing out on deck building options, and that's ultimately what the game is about. It's a deck building game.
And to kind of go on that point too, man, from like the whole review like misses that aspect entirely. So essentially they're like missing 20% of the entire pack per
Well, it'd be
review.
cool too if they said buy the deluxes to get more explorers or more investigators, and also try the first bit out and see what you think as a player.
Yeah. So, I mean, the review is definitely not a complete review because they miss half the game in the deck building and the player cards, and the other huge portion of the game with standalones and return tos. I mean, they're still part of the game. So, yeah.
I'm curious to see what they're going to say in the second one, because in that they're going to be looking at the Forgotten Age, which has I've already been quite vocal about my opinions on the problems with that campaign. The Circle Undone, I mean, as a predominantly solo player, the Circle Undone is a brutal campaign because there are certain scenarios in that are nigh unbeatable as a solo player. So stuff like that is, and then of course Dream Eaters, which I have not completed the campaign yet, but so it's going to be interesting. And then, of course, they raise the specter that they are going to be talking about Lovecraft in gaming, which that's a whole other kettle of fish.
And that can only end one way.
And that's only going to end one way. Yeah. I mean, I get the impression from them that they don't particularly like the Cthulhu mythos as I guess that they think it's been overdone, and that's entirely possible. If you review as many board games as they do, then you've probably seen these tropes time and again, and you're tired of them. But
Arkham's different than like the LCG is much different than like Arkham Horror 3rd Edition, for instance, or like Cthulhu Death May Die. Like those games are, I think they're trying to evoke something different. You know, they're much less story driven. I mean, Arkham 3rd kind of is, but the card game is, you know, like Vase was saying earlier, it's a much more narrative-driven story game. And I think by just flat out saying that you don't particularly care for any of the campaigns, you know, that you're doing a disservice to the story of those campaigns, I think, too.
And I think you're also missing out on, I mean, they do mention standalone mode briefly, but I mean, that's how I play a lot of the time.
Mm-hmm. That's how I play a lot too.
And I think that's how a lot of people do enjoy the game. I mean, they may play a campaign the first time and say, okay, you know, I did well, or I got beat, and then they'll go back and they'll just play the scenarios that they enjoyed.
But I think standalone, you know, I think maybe they don't want to review it because playing standalone means that you'd have to build a deck, and clearly they don't. It seems like they don't like that aspect of the game, so it's just strange to me why you'd, you know, play a deck building Cthulhu game if you don't like deck builders or you don't like Cthulhu games.
You know, which is fine if they state that, like, hey, we like the story, like Man from Lang said, and people agreed. We like the flavor. We don't really do a lot with the deck building, so there's a whole part of this that we're not going to really review, but But I don't think they want to poke that hole in their theory or their review, because then it'll make them look bad.
Yeah, which is interesting considering during their first review, I think EFKA, one of the things he did like was the experience point cost on cards, and saying how, okay, like most games, you just want to play the best cards you possibly can in your deck, but this game basically says, okay, you can do that, but only once you've gained some experience points. But in this review, they sort of ignore the deck building component of it and simply focus on the campaigns themselves, which I would agree that's sort of, you're taking half the game, you're reviewing half the game at that point.
Well, I think that's going to do it for today's discussion, guys. It's certainly been an interesting one. Yeah, I've been your host, Nate, lost in time and space, and I was joined with, as always, my lovely fellow co-hosts.
I'm the man from Lang, host of the Whisper in Darkness YouTube channel.
Can I be pretty instead of lovely?
Sure.